She ran a pipe from under her bed to the fire. Halvor Knutson, 63 winters on the prairie, had been blunt. A woman alone in a board shanty won't see spring. That's not opinion, that's arithmetic. Clara Bergstrom had $47, 2 cords of wood, and walls 1 inch thick. In March, the temperature dropped 90 degrees in 4 hours. But 10 months earlier, Clara Bergstrom had never spent a single night alone on the prairie. She arrived in Stanley County, South Dakota, on the 3rd day of May, 1919. The train from Pierre dropped her at a platform that was nothing more than weathered boards laid across mud. She carried 1 trunk, 1 carpet bag, and a canvas satchel of tools that had belonged to her father. The tools weighed more than everything else combined. The land office clerk in Pierre had filed her claim that morning. 160 acres along the Bad River, 10 miles from town. Free land, the posters said. Free to anyone who could live on it 5 years, make improvements, and survive. Clara was 28 years old. She had a teaching certificate from the Minnesota State Normal School and 12 years of watching her father work metal in his shop in Minneapolis. She had come west because her father was dead, and the debts he left behind consumed more than her teaching salary could pay. The arithmetic in Minneapolis didn't work either, but at least in South Dakota, the arithmetic came with land attached. The man who drove her out to her claim was named Swenson. He charged $2 for the 10-mile journey and didn't speak the entire way. When they arrived, he pointed at a wooden stake driven into the grass. "That's your corner," he said. "Quarter section runs east and north from there." Clara looked at the stake. She looked at the grass extending in every direction, unbroken, treeless, endless. She looked at the sky, which seemed larger here than any sky she had ever seen. "Where do I sleep tonight?" she asked. Swenson shrugged. "Most folks build a shanty. Lumber's $8 a 100 board feet in Pierre, or you can cut sod if you got the back for it." He left her standing beside the stake with her trunk and her carpet bag and her father's tools. The sun was still high. She had perhaps 6 hours of daylight remaining. Clara sat down on her trunk and did the arithmetic. The claim shanty took 11 days to build. Clara hired a neighbor's son to haul lumber from Pierre, 200 board feet at $8 per hundred, plus $3 for the hauling. She bought tar paper for the exterior, $2. A second-hand cook stove, $6.50, shipped from the Sears catalog warehouse in Pierre. Nails, hinges, a glass window salvaged from a collapsed homestead 3 miles east. Total cost, $23.70. She built the walls herself, 10 feet by 12 feet, single board thickness, the minimum the land office would accept as a habitable structure. She had never built anything larger than a birdhouse, but wood was simpler than metal, and her father had taught her to measure twice and cut once. The walls went up crooked. She tore them down and started over. The second attempt held. The tar paper went on easier. She tacked it to the exterior boards in overlapping sheets, working from the bottom up so rain would run off rather than seep through. The roof was more tar paper over rough planks, sloped just enough to shed water. It leaked anyway. Everything leaked. By the end of May, Clara Bergstrom had a cabin. It was ugly, drafty, and too small to stand up straight in some corners where the walls bowed inward. But it was hers. She had $23.30 remaining. Winter was 5 months away. The summer passed in a blur of work. Clara broke 2 acres of sod with a borrowed plow and planted a kitchen garden that the grasshoppers found in July. She bought 6 laying hens from a farmer in Kappa, the nearest settlement, and built a coop behind her shanty from scrap lumber and chicken wire. She took a job teaching summer school at a one-room schoolhouse 4 miles north, walking both ways, earning $8 a month. By September, she had $47 saved. It felt like a fortune. It felt like nothing at all. The first frost came on September 28th. Clara woke to white grass and ice on her water bucket. The temperature that night dropped to 19 degrees. Her cook stove, burning steadily, held the cabin at perhaps 50 degrees near the ceiling. At floor level, where her cot sat against the far wall, the temperature was closer to 40. She added a wool blanket to her bed, then a second blanket, then her winter coat spread over her legs. She still woke shivering. The cold was different here than in Minneapolis. In the city, cold was something you passed through, a few minutes between the streetcar and the door, a brief discomfort before the steam radiator took over. Here, the cold lived with you. It pressed against the walls. It seeped through the cracks. It pooled on the floor like water and refused to leave. Clara understood for the first time that surviving winter would not be a matter of endurance. It would be a matter of mathematics. Fuel consumed versus heat produced versus cold that crept through 1-inch walls. And the mathematics, as she ran the numbers, did not work. Halvor Knutsen arrived on the morning of October 3rd. He was 63 years old, though he looked older, weathered and wind-scoured, his face a topography of squint lines and frostbite scars. He had homesteaded this same land in 1884, back when Dakota Territory was just a name on a map, and the nearest neighbor might be 20 miles distant. He had buried his first wife in childbirth, his second wife in the hard winter of 1886, and 3 children between them. He walked with a limp from frostbite that had cost him 2 toes on his left foot. Knutsen didn't dismount from his horse. He sat in the saddle and studied Clara's shanty the way a doctor might study a patient who was already dead. "How much wood you got?" he asked. Clara pointed to the pile behind her cabin. She had hired the neighbor's son again, paying him to haul cottonwood rounds from the river break 7 miles distant. The wood was stacked in 2 rough cords, each cord measuring 4 feet high, 4 feet wide, 8 feet long. 2 cords, she said. "I'm getting more." "From where?" "I'll hire the haul-in again, or cut my own if I can borrow a saw." Knutsen's expression didn't change. "2 cords won't last you through December, not in that." He gestured at her shanty. "Walls like that you'll burn a cord a month just to keep from freezing solid. That's 6 cords minimum, October through March. 8 if the winter's hard. I have money for more wood." "How much?" Clara hesitated. But there was no point in lying. Knutsen would find out anyway, the way everyone found out everything in a county this empty. $47. Knutsen did the math without pausing. "Wood's running $8 a cord delivered if you can find anyone selling. That's 5 cords, maybe 6. You'll need every stick of it for fuel, which means nothing left for food, nothing for kerosene, nothing for feed for those chickens, nothing for anything except burning." "I'll manage." "No." Knutsen leaned forward in his saddle. "You won't. I'm not trying to be cruel, Miss Bergstrom. I'm trying to tell you what's coming. That cabin you built, it's not a cabin. It's a box. The cold doesn't care how hard you worked on it. The cold goes through those walls like they're not even there." Clara felt her jaw tighten. She had not asked for his assessment. "I've seen women freeze in proper cabins," Knutsen continued. "Sod walls 2 feet thick, root cellars full of supplies, husbands to cut wood. They still froze because the winter came harder than anyone expected, and the fuel ran out and the temperature dropped, and the cold doesn't negotiate. It doesn't bargain. It just takes." He straightened in his saddle. "A woman alone in a board shanty won't see spring. That's not opinion. That's arithmetic." Clara said nothing. "Sell the claim," Knutsen said. "You've got improvements now, the shanty, the coop, the broken ground. Someone will buy it for $100, maybe more. Take the money and go back to wherever you came from. This isn't the place for you." He turned his horse and rode away without waiting for a response. Clara stood in front of her shanty and watched him go. The wind had picked up, pressing the tar paper against the boards, finding every gap and seam. She could feel the cold through her coat, through her dress, through her skin. Knutson was right. The arithmetic didn't work. She had known it since September, running the numbers over and over, hoping each time they would add up differently. They never did. But Clara had not come to South Dakota because the arithmetic worked. She had come because the arithmetic in Minneapolis was worse, a slow drowning in debt that would consume her entire life. Here at least the numbers were her own. Here at least she could choose what to count. She went inside and fed the stove. The cold that winter came in waves. November brought temperatures in the teens and single digits, manageable if uncomfortable. Clara burned her cottonwood steadily, feeding the stove every 3 hours, waking twice each night to add fuel. Her 2 cords became 1 cord. 1 cord became 3 quarters. December turned brutal. The temperature on Christmas Eve dropped to 18 below zero. Clara huddled near the stove in every piece of clothing she owned, her hands wrapped in rags, her breath crystallizing in the air. The far wall of her shanty, 8 feet from the stove, had frost on the inside. Ice formed on the nail heads. Her water bucket froze solid even with the stove running. She bought another cord of wood on December 28th, spending $8 she couldn't afford. Her savings dropped to $39. She stopped buying flour and ate potatoes and eggs instead. She stopped buying kerosene and went to bed when the sun set. And still, every morning she woke shivering. The problem wasn't the stove. The stove burned hot. She could see the metal glowing cherry red in the dark, could feel the heat radiating from it in waves. The problem was the distance, 8 feet from fire to bed, 8 feet of cold air that the heat couldn't cross. Clara lay in her cot one night in early January, shaking so hard her teeth clicked together, and forced herself to think. The stove was hot. The ceiling was warm. She had climbed on a chair to check, and the air near the roof was almost comfortable, 70 degrees or more. But down here, at floor level, where she slept and lived and ate, the temperature was barely above 40. The heat existed. It simply collected in the wrong place. Why? She knew the answer. Anyone who had stood near a fire knew the answer. Heat rises. Hot air is lighter than cold air, so it floats upward, gathering at the highest point in any room. Cold air is heavier, denser, and it sinks, pooling on the floor like water in a basin. Her stove was heating the ceiling. The ceiling was not where she lived. Clara sat up in her cot, blankets wrapped around her shoulders, and stared at the stove across the room. The draft vents glowed with firelight. She could hear the roar of combustion, the wood consuming itself in the iron chamber. A stove needs air to burn. She knew this from her father's forge, from hours of watching him work metal. Fire breathes, he had told her. Give it air, and it lives. Starve it, and it dies. The stove was breathing. It was pulling air in through the draft vents, burning it, sending it up the chimney as smoke and heat. The chimney was a vacuum pump, drawing air constantly, creating a current that flowed from the room into the fire. But where was the air coming from? Clara climbed out of bed, ignoring the cold that bit at her feet, and crouched near the stove. She held her hand in front of the draft vent and felt the pull, gentle but steady, a breeze flowing into the flames. Then she moved her hand lower toward the floor. The air at floor level wasn't moving. It sat still, pooled, motionless. The stove was pulling air from around itself, from waist height, where the draft vents were positioned. The warmest zone in the room, relatively speaking. The stove was eating the warm air and leaving the cold air untouched. Clara stood slowly, thinking, what if she could make the stove eat the cold air instead? Her father's tools were still in the canvas satchel where she had left them in May. Tin snips, a ball-peen hammer, a hand punch, a small anvil, only 8 pounds, but enough for bending sheet metal. He had taught her the basics when she was a girl, letting her help with simple jobs, cutting tin, rolling seams, shaping collars for stovepipe. She hadn't touched the tools since his death. Opening the satchel felt like opening a grave. But Clara was freezing in a cabin that had plenty of heat, and her father's voice was in her head, explaining physics the way he explained everything, plainly, patiently, as if understanding were simply a matter of paying attention. Air wants to move from high pressure to low pressure. A chimney creates low pressure at the bottom because hot air rises. It pulls fresh air in to replace what it pushes out. The hotter the fire, the stronger the pull. A good chimney on a good fire can move 50 cubic feet of air every minute. That's a current. That's a river of air flowing through the room. Clara thought about rivers. Rivers follow the easiest path. They carve channels because channels offer less resistance than solid ground. The stove was pulling air from around itself because that was the easiest path. The draft vents were right there, open and available. But if she gave it a different path, an easier path, it would take that instead. A pipe. A pipe running from the floor where the coldest air pooled to the stove's air intake. The stove's chimney would create the suction. The cold air would flow through the pipe into the combustion chamber and up the chimney. And the warm air at the ceiling with nowhere else to go would sink down to replace it. A convection loop powered by the fire itself. No moving parts, no additional fuel, just a different path for the air to follow. Clara pulled out her father's tin snips and turned them over in her hands. The steel was cold, but the familiar weight settled something in her chest. It might not work. She had never heard of anyone doing this. The heating advice in the almanac said to bank your fire and pile on blankets and endure. No one talked about where the air came from, but no one was freezing in her cabin. No one else was staring at a hot stove across a cold room, doing arithmetic that didn't add up. She would need stovepipe, 4 inches in diameter, 8 or 10 feet in total. She would need stove cement to seal the joints. She would need to cut a hole in her own stove. The most dangerous part, because if she ruined the stove, she would have no heat at all and no money for a replacement. The risk was enormous. The potential reward was survival. Clara Bergstrom set the tin snips on her table and began to sketch. Margaret Solberg's homestead sat 2 miles north. A proper sod house with walls 18 inches thick and a root cellar that held heat even in the coldest weeks. Margaret was 44 years old, a widow with grown children who had scattered to cities back east. She had survived 9 winters on this prairie, and she had taken it upon herself to watch over the young woman in the board shanty who had arrived last spring with nothing but determination and debt. Margaret arrived on December 17th with a jar of preserved plums and an expression Clara had learned to read as concern disguised as neighborliness. "Thought you might want something sweet," Margaret said, pressing the jar into Clara's hands. Her eyes moved around the shanty, taking inventory. The dwindling woodpile visible through the window, the frost on the walls, the blankets piled on the narrow cot. "Thank you." Clara set the plums on her table, next to the sketch she had been working on. Margaret's gaze fell on the paper. "What's that?" Clara hesitated, but Margaret had been nothing but kind, and there was no one else to talk to, and the idea had been circling in her head for 3 days with no one to tell. "I want to run a pipe from under my bed to the stove." Margaret picked up the sketch. She studied it for a long moment, frowning at the lines and measurements. "You want to connect your floor to your fire. The coldest air pools at the floor. The stove pulls air in for combustion. If I give it a path to pull from the floor instead of from around itself, the cold air would go into the fire, and the warm air would fall to replace it, like water filling a hole." Margaret set the sketch down. She looked at Clara with an expression that might have been worry or might have been pity. I've never heard of such a thing. Neither have I. What if it doesn't work? Clara had asked herself this question 100 times. Then I lose 2 days of work and $2 in materials, and I seal the holes and pretend it never happened. $2? Margaret's voice was flat. You have what, $40 left? Maybe less? 39. And you want to spend 2 of them on an experiment, on something no one's ever tried. That might not do anything at all. Clara felt the words as pressure in her chest. Margaret wasn't wrong. $2 was half a cord of wood. $2 was flour and salt and kerosene for a month. $2 was the margin between surviving until spring and running out of everything in February. The stove already heats my cabin, Clara said. I can feel it, at the ceiling, near the chimney, everywhere except where I actually live. I don't need more heat. I need the heat I already have to go to the right place. Margaret looked at the frost on the walls, at the ice on the nail heads, at the breath clouding from her own lips. She had lived through 9 winters in a sod house with proper insulation. She had never felt cold like this inside her own home. I survived 9 winters without running pipes across my floor, she said finally. You have a proper cabin. I have a board shanty with 1-inch walls. Silence stretched between them. Outside, the wind gusted, pressing the tar paper inward, finding every gap. Sometimes, Margaret said slowly, the safe choice is no choice at all. Sometimes the safest thing you can do is refuse to gamble, to hold on to what little you have, to endure until spring and hope it's enough. She paused. And sometimes the safe choice kills you anyway, and you die wishing you'd taken the risk. Clara waited. Margaret shook her head. I don't know, Clara. I truly don't. But if you're going to try this foolish thing, you'd better do it soon. December's bad. January is worse. And February. She stopped, as if the word itself was dangerous. She left without finishing the sentence. Clara sat alone with her sketch and her doubts, and the cold air pooling at her feet. By morning, she had decided. The general store in Kappa was 7 miles east, close enough to walk in summer, far enough to require a horse in winter. Clara borrowed a mare from Margaret, another kindness she could never repay, and rode out on December 22nd with a list in her pocket and $39 in her coat. The store was a low, weathered building with Brennan's general merchandise painted above the door. Earl Brennan had owned it for 15 years, extending credit to homesteaders who couldn't afford to pay, collecting their land when they failed. Half the abandoned claims in Stanley County had passed through his hands at one point or another, bought for back taxes and resold at profit to the next wave of hopeful settlers. Brennan was behind the counter when Clara entered. He was a compact man with careful eyes and soft hands that had never held a plow. He watched her move through the store, selecting items from the shelves, 4 2-foot sections of galvanized stovepipe, 2 90-degree elbows, a can of stove cement. Stovepipe, he said when she set the items on the counter. Middle of December. I need to make repairs. Your chimney's not leaking. I've seen your smoke. Brennan had an unsettling habit of noticing everything. That pipe's not for your chimney. Clara said nothing. 8 feet of 4-inch, 2 elbows, stove cement. Brennan arranged the items on the counter, calculating. You're building something, running pipe somewhere it wasn't meant to go. I'm improving my heating. How? Clara considered refusing to answer. But Brennan's credit kept half the county afloat through winter. Antagonizing him would cost more than it gained. A cold air intake, she said, to pull the floor-level cold into the stove instead of letting it pool. Brennan stared at her. For a moment, Clara thought he might refuse to sell. Then he laughed. It was not a kind sound. A cold air intake. He repeated the words as if tasting something sour. You're going to cut a hole in your stove and run a pipe across your floor because you think you figured out something every farmer and homesteader for the last 50 years has missed. I think I figured out why I'm cold when my stove is hot. You're cold because you built a shanty with walls an inch thick, and you don't have enough fuel, and you're a woman alone on a claim that's going to kill you. Brennan's voice was pleasant, conversational, almost friendly. No pipe is going to change that arithmetic. All you're going to do is waste money you don't have on an idea that won't work, and when it doesn't work, you'll be even shorter than you were before. Clara felt her face flush. Will you sell me the materials or not? Oh, I'll sell them. Brennan began totaling the items. $2.15 cash. I don't extend credit for follies. Clara counted out the coins, her hands steady despite the heat in her cheeks. You know what I think? Brennan leaned forward as she gathered her purchases. I think you'll be in here by February, selling me that stove and whatever else you can carry. I think your claim will go back to the county for taxes, and I think I'll buy it for whatever the county asks, which won't be much, because nobody wants a failed claim with a ruined shanty on it. Clara picked up her pipe and elbows in cement. You're wrong. I've been wrong before. Brennan smiled, showing teeth. Not often, but I hope you prove me wrong, Miss Bergstrom. I truly do. Because if you don't, you'll be walking back to wherever you came from with nothing but frostbite scars to show for your trouble. Clara walked out without answering. The cold hit her like a wall, stealing her breath, burning her cheeks. She mounted Margaret's horse and rode home with her purchases clutched against her chest, Brennan's words circling in her head like crows. The word spread faster than the wind. By Christmas, everyone in Kappa knew about the woman running pipe across her floor. Clara heard it from Margaret, who had heard it from her daughter, who had heard it at church. The Bergstrom woman has lost her mind from the isolation. She's tearing apart her own stove in the middle of winter. She's wasting money she doesn't have on some crazy scheme that won't work. They're saying you've gone snow simple, Margaret reported, her voice carefully neutral. They're saying the loneliness got to you. Clara had heard the term. Snow simple, prairie madness, the peculiar insanity that crept over isolated homesteaders in the endless white months, making them do strange things, see things that weren't there, believe things that couldn't be true. Do you think I've gone snow simple? Margaret was quiet for a long time. I think you're trying to solve a problem that most people just endure. Whether that's crazy or smart? She shrugged. I guess we'll find out. Clara kept working. There was nothing else to do. The construction took 5 days. Day 1 was measurement and planning. Clara cleared the floor along the wall, moving her cot, her trunk, her small table. She chalked a line from the foot of her bed to the corner where the stove sat, mapping the route the pipe would follow. 8 feet horizontal along the baseboard, 2 feet vertical up the back of the stove. She measured twice, 3 times, making sure the angles were right. Day 2 was the stove. This was the part that terrified her. The stove was cast iron, brittle, and unforgiving. A crack in the body would mean fire escaping, smoke filling the cabin, potentially the whole structure burning down. She would have to cut carefully, precisely, hitting the thin spot she had identified on the lower rear panel without damaging the thicker walls around it. She let the fire burn down to coals. She waited 2 hours for the metal to cool, testing it with drops of water until they no longer sizzled. Then she took her father's hand punch and positioned the tip against the iron. The first strike rang through the cabin like a bell. Clara's hand shook. She steadied herself and struck again. It took 3 hours to punch and cut a 4-inch circle through the rear panel. The iron was old, corroded at the edges. easier than she had feared, but every strike sent vibrations through her teeth, through her bones, through the voice in her head that whispered, "If this doesn't work, you've destroyed your only source of heat." By nightfall, she had a hole in her stove. The fire was out. The cabin was already growing cold. She slept in her coat, her mittens, her wool stockings, everything she owned. She woke at 3 in the morning, shivering so hard her cot shook against the floor. Day 3 was the caller. Using her father's tin snips and the salvaged sheet metal from a rusted washtub, Clara cut and bent a flange that would hold the pipe in place and seal the joint against smoke. The work was familiar. Score, bend, fold, hammer the seam, and for a few hours she was back in her father's shop in Minneapolis, learning the trade that no one expected a girl to learn. The collar fit snugly into the hole she had cut. She sealed the edge with stove cement, thick gray paste that smelled of calcium and silica, and set it aside to cure overnight. Day 4 was the pipe. She assembled the sections on the floor, crimping the ends to lock them together the way stovepipe had been joined for 100 years. No welding required, just crimping and seaming and careful alignment. She attached an elbow at the bed end, positioned 2 inches above the floor where the coldest air pooled. Another elbow where the horizontal run turned vertical. The system looked absurd. A metal snake running along her baseboard, disappearing under her bed, emerging to connect with her stove. No one built stoves this way. No one ran pipes this direction, but no one was living in her cabin. No one else had spent nights shivering 8 feet from a fire that couldn't reach them. Day 5 was connection and sealing. Clara slid the horizontal assembly into position, connected the vertical section to her collar, and sealed every joint with stove cement. She checked each connection twice, 3 times, looking for gaps, pressing paste into any crack she could find. Then she stood back and looked at what she had built. $2.15 in materials, 5 days of labor, sunrise to sunset. Her hands were cracked and bleeding from cold metal. She had lost weight she couldn't afford to lose. The temperature inside the cabin, with no fire for 5 days, was barely above freezing. If this worked, she might survive the winter. If it didn't, she had destroyed her stove and wasted her last margin of error on a fool's hope. Clara built a fire. The first hour, nothing seemed different. The stove roared. Heat rose to the ceiling. Clara sat at her table, watching, waiting, trying not to hope. Then she felt it, a draft. Gentle, barely perceptible, but there air moving along the floor toward the stove. She crouched low and held her hand in front of the pipe intake. Cold air flowed past her fingers, pulled by the suction of the chimney, drawn through the pipe and into the fire. The stove was eating the cold. By evening, the temperature at floor level had risen 8 degrees. 8 degrees. Clara measured it with the cheap thermometer she had bought in Pierre back in May, moving it from spot to spot, checking and rechecking. Near the ceiling, 73 degrees. Near the floor, 51 degrees. Still a difference, but less than half what it had been before. She could feel the change without the thermometer. The air at floor level was moving now, circulating, warm air falling to replace the cold air the stove consumed. Her cot, positioned directly above the intake, sat in the warmest part of the floor. That night, for the first time in weeks, Clara slept without shivering. January brought cold that cracked tree bark and froze cattle where they stood. Clara burned her remaining wood slowly, banking the fire at night, but keeping the damper open on her cold air intake. The system worked. It worked through nights of 20 below zero and mornings when the sun rose red over a landscape locked in white. It worked through blizzards that buried her shanty to the windows and through calm days when the cold pressed down like a physical weight. The floor stayed bearable, not warm, never warm, but bearable. 50 degrees instead of 40. The difference between survival and hypothermia. Margaret visited in early January and stood in the cabin, feeling the draft flowing along the floor, watching the air circulate. "I'll be damned," she said quietly. "It actually works. It works. The floor is warm. Warmer, not warm." Margaret shook her head. "I've lived through 9 winters, and I never once thought about where the stove got its air." She paused. "My daughter's cabin is nearly as thin as yours. If this works for you, I'll show her how to build one." "You'd do that?" Clara almost laughed. "What else would I do? Sell the idea? Keep it secret while people freeze?" She gestured at the pipe running along her baseboard. "It's not complicated. Anyone with tin snips and stove cement can do this." Margaret left with the promise to return with her daughter. Clara watched her go and felt something she hadn't felt in months. Hope. But February was coming, and Clara's fuel was running out. The first week of February, she counted her remaining wood, 3/4 of a cord. Call it 6 weeks of burning if she was careful. If the temperatures stayed moderate, if nothing went wrong. The temperatures didn't stay moderate. February 5th dropped to 26 below zero, the coldest night of the winter. Clara burned wood faster than she had planned, feeding the stove every 2 hours, keeping the cabin alive. 3/4 of a cord became half a cord. Half a cord became a third. She bought another cord on February 12th, spending $8 that dropped her savings to 31. The wood was poor quality, cottonwood and willow, fast burning and low heat, but it was all anyone had left. The good wood was gone. March arrived with 3 blizzards in 10 days. Clara burned twisted hay when the wood ran low, the same slough-grass fuel that pioneers had burned for 100 years. It caught fast and burned faster, requiring constant attention, constant feeding, constant vigilance. By March 1st, she had 11 days of fuel remaining. The cold air intake worked perfectly. The floor stayed warm. The heat circulated the way she had designed it to circulate. But the system didn't create fuel. It only made better use of what she had. And what she had was almost gone. March 14th dawned clear and mild. The temperature climbed to 58 degrees by noon. Clara opened her door for the first time in months and smelled mud and melting snow and the faint green promise of grass beneath the white. It felt like spring. It felt like survival. It felt like she had won. She didn't know that 500 miles to the north, an Arctic air mass was sliding south. She didn't know that warm Gulf air was rising to meet it. She didn't know that in 24 hours, 34 people would be dead. Clara Bergstrom went to bed that night with 6 days of fuel remaining and the sound of meltwater dripping from her roof. She woke to wind screaming through walls she could no longer see. The morning of March 15th dawned warm and still. Clara stepped outside at 7 o'clock and felt the sun on her face for the first time in months. The temperature was already climbing past 40 degrees, heading toward 50. Meltwater ran in channels through the snow, carving dark paths toward the creek. The air smelled of mud and thaw, and something green beneath the white. She did her chores in her shirt sleeves, fed the chickens, broke the ice on their water, thin ice now, barely a skin, collected 2 eggs from hens who had finally started laying again after the long dark of winter. The rooster crowed at something invisible on the horizon. Clara counted her remaining fuel, 6 days of wood if she burned carefully, 8 days of twisted hay if she supplemented. 2 weeks maybe, if the weather held mild. And if the weather held mild for 2 weeks, winter was over. The grass would green, the creek would run. She could walk to Kappa and buy supplies on credit, knowing she had survived to repay. The arithmetic, for the first time since October, worked. She allowed herself to feel it, the unfamiliar warmth of hope spreading through her chest like the sun spreading across the prairie. She had made it. The pipe had worked. The skeptics had been wrong. By 10 o'clock, the temperature reached 58 degrees. By noon, the sky had changed. Clara noticed the horizon first. The northwest sky, which had been clear blue all morning, was turning a color she had never seen before, gray-green, bruised, rolling toward her like smoke from a distant fire. The color spread as she watched, eating the blue, swallowing the sun. The temperature dropped 5 degrees in the time it took her to walk from the chicken coop to her door. She stood on her threshold and felt the wind shift. All morning it had blown from the south, warm and wet, carrying the smell of spring. Now it swung north, and the air it carried was different, cold, sharp, carrying something that prickled against her skin like needles. Clara had grown up in Minnesota. She knew what a blizzard looked like from a distance. She had seen them roll across Lake Superior, walls of white that swallowed ships and shorelines whole. This was worse. The wall of cloud was moving faster than anything she had seen before, 40 miles an hour, maybe 50, covering ground like a cavalry charge. And it wasn't just cloud. It was snow already falling, horizontal, driven by winds that screamed even at this distance. Clara ran for the chickens. She grabbed her egg basket, dumped the eggs on the ground, and sprinted for the coop. The temperature was dropping by the minute now. She could feel it on her bare arms, the warmth evaporating like water on a hot stove. She reached the coop as the first gusts hit, staggering her sideways, tearing at her hair. 6 hens. She grabbed them one by one, stuffing them into the basket, ignoring their squawks and pecks. The rooster she caught last, his spurs raking her forearm, drawing blood she didn't have time to notice. She turned back toward the cabin. The wall hit. There was no transition. One moment Clara could see her shanty 15 feet away. The next moment she could see nothing at all. The snow wasn't falling. It was horizontal, driven by wind that must have been 60 miles an hour, ice crystals that cut her face like glass. The cold came with it, not the gradual chill of a winter night, but an instantaneous, brutal plunge, as if she had stepped from a warm room into a frozen lake. Clara couldn't breathe. The wind tore the air from her lungs before she could inhale. She turned her back to it, hunched over her basket of chickens, and tried to think. 15 feet to the cabin. She had walked this path 1,000 times, but she couldn't see the cabin. She couldn't see her own feet. The snow had erased everything, turned the world into a howling white void where direction meant nothing. She remembered what Halvor Knudsen had told her months ago about settlers who froze within feet of their own doors. She understood it now. The distance didn't matter. 15 feet might as well be 15 miles when you couldn't see your hand in front of your face. Clara forced herself to think. The wind had been at her back when she left the coop. Her cabin was downwind from the coop. If she walked with the wind at her back, but the wind was swirling now, gusting from every direction, and she had already turned around twice. She didn't know which way she was facing. She dropped to her knees. The snow was already ankle-deep and rising. She set down the basket, keeping one hand on it, and felt along the ground with the other. Frozen mud, dead grass, nothing that told her where she was. She crawled forward, dragging the basket, feeling with her free hand. 5 feet, 10 feet. Her fingers touched wood, not her cabin. The chicken coop. She had crawled in a circle. Clara pressed her forehead against the rough boards and fought the urge to scream. The cold was in her now, seeping through her clothes, numbing her hands, her feet, her face. She had minutes, not hours. If she didn't find the cabin soon, she would die out here in the snow, 15 feet from her own door. She stood. She turned until the wind hit her back, the strongest gust, the steadiest pressure, and she walked. 1 step, 2, 3, counting, because counting was the only way to measure anything when the world had turned to white. At step 12, she hit the cabin wall hard enough to bruise her shoulder. She felt along the boards until she found the door. She threw herself through it, basket and all, and slammed it shut behind her. The sound of the wind dropped from a scream to a roar. Clara lay on her floor, gasping, her chickens fluttering around her in panic, and watched ice form on her eyelashes. She was inside. She was alive. The storm had just begun. The first hour was chaos. Clara released the chickens. They scattered to the corners, terrified, but alive. She stripped off her wet outer clothes and hung them near the stove. She fed the fire until it roared, then opened the damper on her cold air intake as wide as it would go. The cabin shook with every gust. The tar paper on the windward wall had torn loose. She could hear it flapping, cracking, pulling away from the boards. Cold air screamed through gaps that hadn't existed an hour ago. She stuffed rags into the cracks, but the wind tore them out. She nailed a blanket over the worst section, sacrificing warmth she needed to stop air she couldn't block any other way. By 2 o'clock, the temperature outside had dropped to 20 degrees. By 4 o'clock, it was below zero. The sun set somewhere behind the clouds, invisible, and the darkness that followed was absolute. Clara checked her thermometer by lamplight. Ceiling, 68 degrees. Floor, 46 degrees. Cold, but survivable. The intake pipe was working, pulling the coldest air off the floor, feeding it to the stove, keeping the heat circulating. Without the pipe, the floor temperature would be in the 30s. She would be hypothermic by morning. She fed the stove every hour. Wood first, then twisted hay when the wood ran low. She had 6 days of fuel, but that calculation assumed normal burning. This was not normal burning. The stove needed to run full blast just to fight the cold that poured through her shattered walls. 6 days became 4 days. 4 days became 3. The storm screamed on. The second morning brought silence. Clara woke to absolute quiet. No wind, no creaking boards, no howling through the gaps. For a terrible moment, she thought she had gone deaf. Then she realized the cabin was buried. Snow had drifted to the roofline, sealing her inside, muffling all sound. The windows were white rectangles of packed snow. The door wouldn't budge when she pushed, 4 feet of drift pressing against it. She was trapped. Clara climbed on her chair and looked at the chimney. Gray daylight filtered down through the pipe. The chimney was still clear, rising above the drifts. She could breathe. The fire could breathe. But she couldn't get out. She took inventory. Food, salt pork, dried beans, potatoes, flour. Enough for 5 days if she rationed carefully. Water. She could melt snow from around the door, packing it into pots and setting them near the stove. Fuel. 3 days, maybe 4, at the current burn rate. Less if the cold continued. The storm wasn't over. She could feel the pressure building again, hear the distant moan of wind gathering strength. This was the eye, the pause, the breath before the next assault. Clara sat on her cot and did the arithmetic. 3 days of fuel, an unknown duration of storm, walls that were falling apart, a door she couldn't open. The numbers didn't work. They had never worked. She had survived this long through luck and ingenuity, but luck runs out, and ingenuity can't create wood from nothing. She was going to die in this cabin. She had been going to die since the moment she built it. Halvor Knutson had been right all along, and then she heard the sound that changed everything. A cough, muffled, distant, but unmistakable, coming from outside, from somewhere in the buried white, and then a voice, thin and desperate. "Help! please, help. Clara threw herself at the door. She shoved with her shoulder, with her hip, with everything she had. The drift resisted, packed snow, heavy as concrete, frozen solid. She grabbed a pot from the stove and used it as a shovel, scooping snow from around the edges, carving a gap she could work with. The voice came again, closer now. Please, is anyone there? Clara knew that voice. Anna Lindqvist, 9 years old, daughter of the Swedish family who homesteaded 4 miles north. I'm coming, Clara shouted, though she didn't know if sound could carry through the snow. Stay where you are, I'm coming. She dug. Her hands went numb. She kept digging. The pot bent, and she threw it aside and dug with her bare fingers, tearing at the snow, feeling her nails break and not caring. 20 minutes. 30. She carved a tunnel through the drift, a passage barely wide enough for her body, sloping upward toward the surface. The light grew brighter as she dug. The air grew colder. She broke through into a world of white. The wind was rising again, gusts that staggered her, but the full force of the storm hadn't returned yet. She could see perhaps 10 feet in any direction. Snow lay in drifts taller than her head, sculpted by wind into frozen waves. Anna! Clara screamed. Anna, where are you? Here! The voice came from her left, weak and wavering. Please, please help us! Clara scrambled toward the sound, falling, rising, plowing through snow that reached her waist. She found them 20 feet from her door, Anna Lindqvist, 9 years old, clutching her little brother Petter to her chest. Anna's lips were blue. Her eyes were glassy. Petter wasn't moving. We were walking home, Anna gasped. We were at the Hendersons, and we tried to walk home, and the storm. Don't talk. Clara grabbed Petter from Anna's arms. The boy was 5 years old, small for his age, and he weighed nothing at all. His skin was waxy and cold. She couldn't tell if he was breathing. She dragged both children toward the tunnel. Half carrying Anna, Petter clutched against her chest. The wind was picking up now, the brief respite ending, the full fury of the storm preparing to strike again. They made it to the tunnel as the wall of white closed in. Inside, Clara stripped the children's wet clothes with fingers too numb to feel what they were doing. She wrapped Petter in every blanket she owned and positioned him directly in front of the stove, in the warmest spot in the cabin, where the radiant heat fell from the ceiling and the cold air intake drew from directly beneath. Petter was hypothermic. His core temperature had dropped below the point where his body could warm itself. If Clara didn't raise his temperature in the next hour, his heart would stop. She held him against her own body, sharing her warmth, rubbing his arms and legs to restore circulation. Anna huddled beside them, shivering violently, her teeth chattering so hard she couldn't speak. The floor, Anna managed finally through the shivers. It's warm. The floor's warm. Clara didn't have breath to explain. She was counting Petter's heartbeats against her chest, watching his lips, waiting for color that wouldn't come. 40 minutes. The stove roared. The intake pipe pulled cold air from the floor, fed it to the fire, circulated the heat back down. The floor temperature held at 48 degrees, not warm, but warm enough. Warm enough to stop the slide, warm enough to save a child's life. Petter's eyelids fluttered. Clara felt the change before she saw it, a slight relaxation of the waxy tension in his limbs, a deepening of his shallow breath. His lips were still blue, but less blue than before. His fingers, curled against her chest, twitched. Petter? Clara whispered. The boy opened his eyes. He looked at her without recognition, confused, disoriented, caught somewhere between sleep and death. You're safe, Clara said. You're warm. You're going to be all right. She didn't know if it was true. But she said it anyway, and Petter closed his eyes and breathed, and the cold air intake hummed along the floor, and the storm howled outside, and the three of them huddled together in a 10 by 12 shanty while the world tried to kill them. The storm lasted 3 days. 3 days of wind that never stopped, cold that never lifted, darkness that swallowed the days whole. Clara burned everything she had: wood, hay, corn cobs, the broken slats from a shipping crate she had saved for kindling. When the fuel ran low, she burned pages from a catalog, feeding them one at a time into the flames. The children slept in her cot, curled together under every blanket. Clara dozed sitting up, her back against the stove, waking every hour to feed the fire. The chickens roosted in the corners, surviving on scraps, providing eggs that Clara fed to Petter with a spoon. Anna talked during the long hours of darkness. She talked about her parents, about their farm 4 miles north, about the walk to the Hendersons that had seemed so easy in the warm morning sun. She talked about the storm hitting, the world disappearing, the endless wandering through snow that reached her waist. She talked about carrying Petter when he couldn't walk anymore, about hearing Clara's voice through the wind, about thinking she was already dead and the voice was an angel. "Why is the floor warm?" she asked on the second night. "Our house doesn't have a warm floor." Clara showed her the pipe, explained how it worked. Anna listened with the fierce attention of a child who has learned that understanding things might save your life. "Like drinking through a straw," Anna said. "The fire drinks the cold air." "Exactly like that." "Why doesn't everyone do this?" Clara didn't have an answer. She was too tired to think, too cold to philosophize. "I don't know," she said. "I don't think anyone thought of it before. You thought of it. I was cold. I had to do something." Anna considered this. "I'm going to tell my father," she said. "When the storm stops, I'm going to tell him about the pipe." "Good," Clara said. "Tell everyone." The storm broke on the morning of March 18th. Clara woke to silence and dug her way out of the cabin to find a world transformed. The snow lay in drifts 12 feet high, burying fences, swallowing outbuildings, turning the prairie into a landscape of frozen white waves. The temperature had dropped to 18 below zero overnight and was only slowly climbing. But the wind had stopped. The sky was clear. The sun was rising. Clara stood in the snow and breathed air that didn't try to kill her. Behind her, in the cabin, 2 children were alive who should have been dead. Beneath her feet, a pipe ran along the floor, feeding cold air to a fire that had never gone out. She had made it. Against every prediction, every calculation, every piece of arithmetic that said a woman alone in a board shanty couldn't survive, she had made it. And she wasn't alone anymore. Henrik Lindqvist arrived that afternoon. He had spent the storm trapped in his own house, praying for children he assumed were dead. He had searched through the drifts for 2 hours that morning, following the path Anna and Petter should have taken, finding nothing but snow. Then a neighbor had told him, "The Bergstrom woman has your children. They're alive." Henrik was a large man, a former logger, not given to emotion. He stood in Clara's doorway, looked at his children wrapped in blankets by the stove, and wept. "How?" he managed. "The storm. They were out in the storm. They found my cabin. I brought them inside." "Your cabin." Henrik looked around the shanty, the thin walls, the torn tar paper, the pipe running along the floor. By every measure, this cabin should have been a death trap. His own farmhouse had proper walls, a proper roof, a proper foundation. His children had survived in a board shanty while neighbors with better shelter had frozen. "What is that?" He pointed at the pipe. Clara explained. "The cold air intake, the convection loop. the physics of heat rising and cold falling and giving the stove a path to pull what you wanted it to pull. Henrik listened without speaking. When she finished, he knelt and felt the floor with his palm. The temperature was 52 degrees warmer than his own farmhouse floor, warmer than any floor he had ever felt in winter. "This saved them," he said. "The fire saved them. This just put the fire in the right place." Henrik stood. He looked at Clara for a long moment. This woman alone, this woman everyone had dismissed, this woman who had survived a storm that killed 34 people across North Dakota. "I want to build one," he said. "Show me how." The deaths came in like tide. Word traveled slowly through the buried countryside, carried by survivors digging out, by neighbors checking on neighbors, by the grim mathematics of counting who had made it and who hadn't. Hazel Miner, 15 years old, had died 2 miles south of Center, protecting her younger siblings with her own body. She had lain on top of them through the night, using her warmth to keep them alive, punching them when they tried to sleep. They were found 200 feet from a farmhouse, safety they couldn't see through the snow. The siblings survived. Hazel was frozen solid. Chicken Pete. Johnson, an old bachelor who lived in a dugout east of Kappa, had frozen when his fire went out. They found him sitting upright by his cold stove, hands reaching toward ashes. 3 members of the Olson family had died within sight of their own barn. The father had gone out to check on livestock. The sons had gone out to find the father. None of them had made it back. 34 dead in 3 days. 34 frozen bodies waiting for the spring thaw to be buried properly. Clara Bergstrom, in her board shanty with her pipe and her stove and her 2 borrowed children, had survived. Halvor Knutson came on the 4th day after the storm. He rode up on his gray horse, the same horse he had ridden when he told Clara she would never see spring. He dismounted slowly, favoring his bad leg, and stood in front of the cabin he had expected to find empty. Clara met him at the door. She didn't speak. She had nothing to say to him that the facts didn't say better. Knutson looked at the cabin, at the patched tar paper, the nail holes where she had tacked blankets over gaps, the improvised repairs that had held through 3 days of screaming wind, at the pipe visible through the window, running along the baseboard. "May I come in?" Clara stepped aside. Knutson entered the cabin and stood in the center of the room, turning slowly. He studied the pipe, the collar where it entered the stove, the intake beneath the bed. He crouched and felt the floor temperature. He put his hand in front of the intake and felt the gentle pull of cold air flowing toward the fire. "How much fuel did you burn?" he asked. "October to now?" 3 cords total, a little less. Knutson's expression shifted. 3 cords was half what a proper cabin used, less than half what a board shanty should have required. Not because the system saved fuel, the fire still burned the same, but because the fuel that burned actually heated where people lived, instead of warming a ceiling no one could reach. "I told you the arithmetic didn't work," he said. "The arithmetic you knew didn't work. I found different arithmetic." Knutson stood slowly. His knees cracked. He looked old in a way he hadn't looked in October, worn down by winter, by age, by decades of watching people fail. "I've been wrong before," he said. "Not often, not about things like this, but I was wrong about you." It wasn't an apology. Halvor Knutson didn't apologize, but it was an acknowledgement, and from him that was more than Clara had expected. "I want you to show me how it works," he said. "I want to understand it." "So you can tell people they're fools for trying something new?" "So I can tell people they might survive if they try something smart." Knutson met her eyes. "I've buried enough folks. If this pipe of yours saves even one, I'll tell everyone who'll listen." Clara studied him for a long moment. Then she began to explain. Margaret Solberg arrived the day after Knutson. She carried a notebook and pencil, the same one she had brought on her first visit in December, but her expression had changed. The doubt was gone. In its place was something that looked like hunger. "My daughter's cabin is as thin as yours," she said. "Show me everything." Clara showed her. The intake position, 2 inches above the floor. The horizontal run along the baseboard, angled slightly for drainage of condensation. The collar, crimped and sealed with stove cement. The damper that controlled airflow. Margaret wrote everything down. She asked questions. What diameter pipe? How long could the run be? What happened if the chimney backflowed? "I told you the safe choice was no choice," Margaret said when the lesson was finished. "I told you to be careful, to hold on to what little you had, to endure until spring. You told me sometimes the safe choice kills you anyway." "Did I?" Margaret closed her notebook. "Then I was smarter than I knew. Earl Brennan didn't come to the cabin. He didn't apologize. He didn't acknowledge that he had been wrong. But when Clara walked into his store in late March needing flour and salt and kerosene, he totaled her purchases without comment. $2.15, the same amount she had spent on pipe and cement in December. "Cash or credit?" he asked. Clara set the coins on the counter. "Cash." Brennan counted the money and bagged her goods. His face was neutral, professional, revealing nothing. But as Clara turned to leave, he spoke. "I heard about the Lindqvist children." Clara stopped. "I heard you pulled them out of the snow, kept them alive for 3 days while the storm blew itself out." "I had help. I had a warm floor." Brennan was silent for a moment, then, "I suppose you'll be wanting more stovepipe, for the folks who've been asking about your contraption." Clara turned back. Brennan's expression hadn't changed, but something in his voice had shifted. Not warmth, Earl Brennan didn't do warmth, but perhaps a grudging respect. "I suppose I will." "I'll keep it in stock." Brennan made a note on his ledger. 4-inch galvanized, as much as you need. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't even an acknowledgement that he had been wrong. But it was something, a recognition that Clara Bergstrom would be here next winter, and the winter after that, and Earl Brennan would be selling her stovepipe instead of buying her failed claim. Clara took her purchases and walked out into the spring sunshine. The method spread. Within a month, Clara had explained the cold air intake to every homesteader within 10 miles of her claim. She sketched the design on scraps of paper, drew diagrams in the dirt, demonstrated the physics with pots of water and candle flames. She charged nothing. She refused payment when it was offered. "It's not complicated," she told anyone who asked. "Anyone with tin snips and stove cement can build one. The fire does all the work, you're just telling it where to pull from." Henrik Lindqvist installed a system that summer, running pipe from his root cellar to his cook stove. His wife reported that their kitchen floor, always cold in winter, stayed comfortable even in January. Margaret's daughter built one for her claim shanty east of Pierre. She adapted the design, adding a second intake near the door to capture cold air that blew in when people entered. A family in Kappa tried a variation using the existing stovepipe and an external intake, pulling air from outside instead of from the floor. It worked, but burned more fuel. The outside air was colder than floor air and took more heat to warm. By the winter of 1920 to 1921, at least 14 homesteads in Stanley County had some version of Clara's cold air intake installed. The modifications varied, some crude, some elegant, some that barely worked, and some that worked beautifully, but the principle remained the same. Force the stove to pull the coldest air. Let the heat distribute itself. Clara never patented the design. She never sought credit. She never wrote an article for the agricultural bulletins that might have spread the idea across the plains. It's just physics, she told the county extension agent when he came around asking about heating innovations. Nothing I invented, I just paid attention to where the cold was. The agent took notes, but never published anything. The modification was too simple, too homemade, too obviously the work of a desperate woman in a board shanty rather than an engineer in a laboratory. The idea spread anyway, the way good ideas have always spread from neighbor to neighbor, whispered between fence posts, sketched on the backs of envelopes. It saved lives in winters that followed, though no one kept count. Clara Bergstrom proved up her claim in 1924, 5 years after filing. She had survived 5 winters in her board shanty, each one a little easier than the last, each one teaching her something new about the arithmetic of cold and heat and survival. She sold the land in 1927 for $1,800. It was a good price, more than most claims fetched, more than anyone had expected a woman's quarter section to be worth. The buyer was a young Norwegian couple from Minnesota just starting out. Clara spent an hour showing them the cold air intake before she signed over the deed. She used the money to pay off the last of her father's debts and buy a small house in Pierre. She taught school there for another 23 years, retiring in 1950 to a pension and a rocking chair and a reputation as the strictest grammar teacher Stanley County had ever known. She never married. She never spoke publicly about the winter of 1920 or the pipe that ran under her bed. When her former students asked about her homesteading days, she changed the subject. Clara Bergstrom died in 1961 at 70 years old. Her obituary in the Pierre paper mentioned her teaching career, her church membership, her long service on the library board. It did not mention Halvor Knudsen or Earl Brennan or 2 children pulled from a snowdrift. It did not mention a hole cut in a cast iron stove or 8 feet of galvanized pipe. Some things don't make it into obituaries. On March 15, 1920, the temperature dropped from 58 degrees to below zero in 4 hours. The wind reached 60 miles per hour, driving snow so thick that settlers couldn't see their own hands. 34 people died across North Dakota, some in the open, some in their own homes, some within feet of safety they couldn't reach. Halvor Knudsen had been certain. "A woman alone in a board shanty won't see spring," he'd said. "That's not opinion, that's arithmetic." Clara Bergstrom saw spring. She saw it through a hole she cut in her own stove and 8 feet of galvanized pipe running along her baseboard. She saw it through the cold air that pooled beneath her bed and fed the fire that kept her alive. She saw it because she understood something the arithmetic couldn't measure, that heat rises and cold falls, and a stove will pull whatever air you give it, and survival sometimes depends on nothing more than paying attention to what's already there. The pipe rusted away decades ago. The shanty collapsed in the 1940s, boards and tar paper returning to the prairie that had always wanted them back. But somewhere in Stanley County, South Dakota, the foundations of Clara's claim still lie beneath the grass, 10 feet by 12 feet of stone and memory, marking the place where one woman changed the arithmetic and lived. The wind still blows there, crossing the open ground without obstacle. And in winter, when the temperature drops and the snow flies horizontal and the cold settles on the land like a weight, the grass bends before it, and the coyotes burrow into their dens, and the warmth of summer seems as distant as the stars. But the foundation holds.